Without this man, the United States might not exist in the form it does today. He personally financed George Washington's army when the government had no money left to pay it. He signed the Declaration of Independence. At one point, he was almost certainly the richest man in the entire country, wealthier than Washington, wealthier than Jefferson, wealthier than nearly anyone in America. And a few years later, he was sitting alone in a debtor's prison cell, so broke and so publicly ruined that Congress passed an entirely new law just to get him out. His name was Robert Morris, and his downfall is the reason the United States has bankruptcy law at all. Robert Morris wasn't a soldier or a career politician. He was a merchant and one of the most successful in colonial America. Born in England and brought to the colonies as a teenager, Morris rose through Philadelphia's shipping and trading business until he became a partner in one of the largest commercial firms in North America, with trade connections stretching across Europe and the Caribbean. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Morris became something the young United States desperately needed, a man who could actually produce money when the government had none. Congress, in its early years, had almost no ability to tax and almost no credit of its own. It relied entirely on borrowing, and often nobody was willing to lend to a rebellious government that might not survive the year. At multiple critical points during the war, the Continental Army came dangerously close to collapsing, not from battlefield losses, but from simply running out of money to pay, feed, and supply its soldiers. Morris repeatedly stepped in, using his own personal credit, his own reputation, and his own network of merchant connections to secure loans and supplies to keep Washington's army functioning. Historians widely credit Morris's financial maneuvering before the Battle of Yorktown, arguably the war's decisive engagement, as being just as essential to the American victory as anything that happened on the battlefield itself. Morris signed the Declaration of Independence. He later served as the nation's first superintendent of finance, essentially running the entire financial apparatus of the United States government. For a period, Robert Morris wasn't just wealthy. He was arguably the single most financially powerful private citizen in the country, a man whose personal credit was, at times, more reliable than the government's own. So how does a man like that end up in prison? Land. After the war ended and Morris stepped back from public office, he turned his enormous fortune toward what seemed, at the time, like the safest bet in America, buying up enormous tracts of undeveloped land, betting that the growing young nation would need somewhere to expand, and that anyone holding that land early would become fantastically wealthy as settlers poured westward. Morris wasn't cautious about it in the slightest. Through ventures like the North American Land Company, he purchased millions of acres across New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas, an amount of land larger than some entire European countries, much of it bought on borrowed money, stacking new debt on top of old debt, all based on the confident assumption that land values would only climb and buyers would inevitably come. For a while, it genuinely looked like a brilliant strategy. Morris had, after all, correctly predicted bigger financial gambles before, but the timing turned against him. An economic downturn hit, credit tightened across the country, and land sales slowed to a near standstill. Morris found himself holding millions of acres of largely worthless, unsellable land, and millions of dollars in debts that were coming due regardless of whether he had any income to pay them. Here's what most people don't realize about early America. If you couldn't pay your debts, you could actually be thrown in prison for it. Not for committing a crime in the way we think of one today, but simply for owing money you were unable to repay. It sounds almost unbelievable now, but debtors' prisons were a completely normal, legally accepted part of the American justice system at the time. Creditors could have a debtor arrested and held indefinitely, essentially as leverage, until the debt was somehow settled. Even though imprisonment obviously made it far harder for the debtor to ever earn the money to pay what they owed in the first place. In February of 1798, Robert Morris, the man who had personally helped bankroll American independence, whose name sat on the Declaration alongside Franklin and Jefferson, was arrested and locked inside Philadelphia's Prune Street debtors' prison. He would spend more than 3 years there. Conditions inside weren't as brutal as a criminal prison, and Morris, still a man of some remaining status, reportedly received visitors regularly, including, by some accounts, George Washington himself, an old friend and wartime ally, coming to see the man who had once helped keep his army alive, now sitting behind bars over unpaid debts. The visits were partly sympathy and partly sheer disbelief that a founding father could fall this far. Morris's imprisonment became something of a national embarrassment, and not a quiet one. Here was a man whose signature was on the Declaration of Independence, a man credited with financially saving the Revolution, sitting in a cell because of a legal system that offered debtors almost no real path forward, only punishment indefinitely, with no built-in mechanism for a fresh start. At the time, the United States had no federal bankruptcy law whatsoever. If you went bankrupt, your fate depended entirely on which state you happened to owe money in, and most state systems of the era offered debtors little to no meaningful relief, often trapping them in prison for years, with no legal way out short of somehow repaying every cent. In April of 1800, Congress passed the very first federal bankruptcy law in American history, the Bankruptcy Act of 1800. And according to Morris's own biographers, one of the direct specific motivations behind finally passing this law, after years of failed attempts at bankruptcy legislation, was to create a legal pathway for men exactly like Robert Morris, and there were others suffering the same fate, to be formally released from prison with their debts legally discharged, rather than left to rot indefinitely. This first version of American bankruptcy law was nothing like what exists today. It only covered merchants, bankers, brokers, and underwriters. Ordinary individuals with ordinary debts weren't included at all. And critically, it only allowed involuntary bankruptcy, meaning a debtor couldn't simply choose to file on their own initiative. A creditor essentially had to petition the court to release them through the process. It was narrow, procedurally messy, and structurally favored creditors over debtors in almost every respect. But for its intended purpose, it worked. After a long, drawn-out negotiation process involving his creditors, on August 26, 1801, Robert Morris walked out of Prune Street Prison a free man, his massive debts formally discharged under a law that very likely wouldn't have existed, or wouldn't have existed when it did, without his own very public, very humiliating fall from grace playing out in front of the entire young nation. The Bankruptcy Act of 1800 didn't last long. It was repealed just 3 years later in 1803, widely criticized as unpopular and vulnerable to abuse by both debtors and the commissioners who administered it. It would take almost an entire century of repeated attempts, repeals, and legislative rewrites, laws passed in 1841 and 1867 that were each themselves later repealed, before the United States finally settled in 1898 on a lasting bankruptcy system that formed the foundation of what still exists today. But that very first law, flawed, narrow, and short-lived as it genuinely was, exists in American legal history in significant part because Congress watched one of the very men who helped create the United States lose absolutely everything he had, and decided the law needed to offer people some kind of path to start over. Robert Morris helped finance a revolution that changed the world. Then, almost as a footnote to that legacy, in the most painful way imaginable, he helped create the very first version of a legal safety net that still protects millions of Americans navigating financial ruin today. If you like learning the surprising, deeply human origin of a law that still shapes lives every single day, subscribe. History hides in places you'd never think to look.